You're listening to the Cash Flow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner, your source for investing made easy. Here's Andy Tanner.
Welcome to the Cash Flow Academy podcast. I'm your host, Andy Tanner. This is where we make investing simple. What a timely topic for this particular episode. Very exciting. We have Mark Belmar, and we're going to talk about food. I'm going to let him introduce himself a little bit, but if you've been on the web, he's NPR, covers him, The Guardian, articles everywhere. And right now, it's an interesting time. We've just passed through a pandemic, which can cause shortages, but now we have inflation, and people wonder what is the world going to look like. Hey, food, clothing, shelter is number one on the list. So, Mark, first of all, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Andy.
And give us just a little bit of your background. What brought you to the point where you said, you know what, I'm going to write a book. The book you wrote is I feel like it's like economist to economist, right? Called Doing Economics, what you should have learned in grad school but didn't. Grad school, my gosh, Mark, I barely got through Econ 101.
Yeah, no, you're right. It is a book that is economist to economist. It is written for an audience of other econ researchers. But to give you a little bit of background, so I became an economist, and I tell that story fairly often. But I became an economist because I started out college wanting to be a philosopher. And so, where I grew up, you go straight into a program, right? We typically don't have a freshman year. You go into a 3-year specialized program, and that's your bachelor of something in something. And I had elected to do a Bachelor of Arts in philosophy. And after a year, I did what I think most philosophy students do at some point after each semester, I would say, which is to kind of seriously question myself and ask myself, what am I going to do with this degree? And I realized that, because I wanted to have a job, right? And I realized that what I liked about philosophy was political philosophy on the one hand, and I liked philosophy of science, logic, the more kind of analytical stuff, including analytical philosophy on the other hand. And I thought, well, what can combine these two things? And I liked the social sciences and political economy. And I was then desk editor of the college's newspaper. And I had just written an article about a tenure case that had gone south in the econ department. And I thought, I'm going to major in economics. So I swiftly declared a minor in philosophy, switched to a major in economics. And then I wanted to do that and go to law school afterwards. But the master's, the program offered a terminal master's, and I saw a lot of kind of my friends go into that master's and go work for various government ministries in Ottawa, like Ministry of Revenue, Ministry of Finance. And I thought, well, why don't I do that? Because that's a really cool fallback, right? If law school doesn't pan out, at least I can go work, as an economist for the federal government. And I realized that I had been kind of a middling undergraduate. I had something like a 3.2 GPA out of 4.3, not out of 4.0. So this was nothing to write home about. And then when I started the master's, I cut out all of the kind of like the extracurricular stuff, like the college newspaper and things like that. And I all I had in my life then was studying. And I realized that there was a 1-to-1 relationship between how many hours I worked on my studies and my grades. And I got really good grades then. And so that's when my professor started saying, well, have you thought about doing a PhD at some time? And that's when I developed myself an interest in economics research. And I thought, well, if I go work for the federal government, I will not be applying all this stuff I'm learning. And, I really wanted to keep doing more of that than doing kind of independent research. And so I finished my master's in January of 2001. I was going to start my PhD in the following September. I had 6 months kind of in between. And I was lucky enough to find a 6-month internship at a UN agency in Rome that was in agricultural economics, which was what my PhD was going to be in. The program changed its name to applied economics in the meantime while I was there, but everything kind of fell into place. And then by the time I was back from Italy, it was time to go to Cornell, and I did my PhD there in applied economics. And I've been doing economics ever since. And so that's a little bit of my background. So you're interested in food prices and inflation and things like that. Well, that's the agricultural economics angle, because a lot of my research to this day is about food security, is about food prices. Even though my dissertation at the time was more about kind of agrarian contracts. I wrote a lot about kind of land tenancy contracts, but there was a small part of my dissertation that was about contract farming, which is when a processor delegates the task of growing a specific crop to producers and buys that crop, kind of basically it's production under contract, which is very pervasive in value chains in this country and other industrialized countries. Sure. And kind of, backward inducting from there, that's where all this kind of my interest in food prices and food value chains came from.
Well, I will tell you this, your initial experience in trying to hold politics in one hand and logic in the other, that's an interesting juxtaposition for sure. And we might have come full circle with this now.
I think so, yeah. I mean, and that's the thing, right, is I was very interested in kind of these, it was not very concrete, right? It was like, I like to read Rousseau and Hobbes and other thinkers about how, how do we think about how the polity structures itself, or how do we structure a polity for whatever outcome you're interested in. And then, the more kind of mathematical way of looking at things. And as it turns out, when I went through my first year in graduate school, towards the end of our micro theory sequence, we did a lot of what's called social choice, which is kind of the micro theory of how we allocate specific things. And and I found it at the time very elegant, but completely devoid of interest, because very limited in its application. It's very, very mathematical. And its reach is very limited because it is very mathematical, because you come up with kind of some certain impossibility results where you're like, okay, so we can't get this kind of allocation. Well, great, let's just throw our hands in the air and just move on to something else.
As time goes on, a person would like to find that that the necessity of life would become more rigid. In other words, we could have a greater amount of surety that we'd have those things. And it's just an amazing change in economics to take a moment right now and think about the fragility of a food supply chain, as opposed to, I'm in my 50s. And I'm in my lower 50s. I can still say I'm in my early 50s, I guess.
I'm getting there soon. I'm in my upper 40s.
I'm in my mid 50s. We'll say that. But, my grandmother got, I would say, the majority of their food from where they lived on the farm. My mom, she had milked a cow before and that type of thing. My wife grew up on a farm. I had a garden when we were growing up, and we worked in a garden, and we knew what it was like to snip peas or beans and to hoe and to rake. And we would, get quite a bounty, raspberries, grapes, potatoes, all on down the line, all the carrots, all the things you would have. And so a vegetable garden was something. Nowadays, boy, we have a lot more people to feed, and the urban versus rural dependence is a fascinating idea that, my kids, I'm kind of ashamed to say, we're starting to garden, and I'm having to learn all over again, simply so they can have the experience of, wow, this is where food comes from. So, I mean, it's strange that you would think as like access to medicine, access to clothing, access to, like, my mom would sew the clothes for my sisters. I feel like I'm in the 1800s here, right? But our dependence on goods and services has changed with globalization. Why can't I get something now? Because it's nearshored, off the coast. So can you talk about the risk? Let's talk about the fragility, and is there an increased risk of food crisis? Or, I go to Iowa and there's just miles of corn and huge combines bigger than my house roaming around. Is the modernization, I guess, a decrease of the risk or an increase of the risk? What's your thoughts on the risk of food shortage?
Yeah, there are so many things to unpack in what you said that it's, I think we could have a 24-hour chat on this if we had the time, but focusing on the risk, I think the fact that we are more dependent on international trade increases the fragility and exposure to risk, right? As we have seen proof of that over the last 2 years, where if there's a cluster of COVID cases in Shanghai and in the port, and they decide to kind of send people home or lock the port down, we are now kind of dependent on those things. And I think what we're going to see, and what we're already seeing, is a disengagement from not from international trade necessarily, but from international trade with specific places. And we've seen that this week with the meeting of the Quad that President Biden attended. I think there's kind of a desire to reorient our international trade so as to not depend entirely on certain partners, and also to kind of bring some of the of what we are purchasing from other countries back to the United States, I think.
This is an interesting thing politically, particularly in monetary policy and in fiscal policy, because you have forces that are inflationary and forces that are deflationary. Globalization is deflationary.
Correct.
But if you say we're going to constrain that in some way, we're going to pick and choose more, that is, I don't know what the opposite of, is it localization, I suppose? I don't know what the opposite word of
that would be it, right? If it's global versus local, it has to be localization.
Localization is a word. Am I inventing words here? I don't know, but localization creates there's less supply, and chances are, there's places in the world that will work and give labor cheaper than maybe like in my home country, the United States or Canada. How does this play with inflation?
Yeah, I think we're, if we are going to kind of bring these things back here, if we're going to kind of, not trade with the person, typically I like to imagine that, as an economist, of course, I like to imagine that people are optimizing, right? That if we are sourcing something from somewhere, it's because we are sourcing it from the place where it is cheapest, or, for a certain degree of quality, it is the cheapest. And so if we are going to take our marbles back and put them somewhere else and source a certain product from a different place, that probably means that it's going to be slightly more expensive, right? And that's inflationary pressure right there. And of course, if we are to do it here instead of purchasing it from elsewhere or from somebody else, that is also going to be more expensive. So definitely, right? I mean, one of the benefits, and that's what we learn in economics of increased trade, not just with other countries, but with other people, with other states, and so on, is the fact that you get a lot more stuff. So you get more variety, and you get it for cheaper, right? And so I think that is the drawback, is that we are going to, if that's the choice that we make as a society, and there certainly are good kind of risk minimizing reasons to make that choice. I mean, up until 2 years ago, I would have said, what, localization, deglobalization? Are you insane? We've never had things this good, right, for this cheap. But now I'm kind of thinking twice about it. I mean, I'm less bullish about globalization, or I would say I'm more bullish about kind of constrained or kind of qualified globalization than I used to.
It is an interesting thing. Some people, a food problem is an inflation problem. There is my heart goes out to people. We'll go fill up the gas tank, and I'll look around, and you'll see people who are less fortunate, and they see those signs of $5 a gallon or whatever it is in the States, average, some places $6. I go to the grocery store, I'll see who I think might be a single mom, and that grocery cart has essentials in it, and so there's the inflation part that's tough. But now you're trying to get baby formula, eggs. We eat a lot of eggs. My wife lifts a lot of weight, so she eats a lot of eggs, and all of a sudden, even if you feel you've done well for yourself, you in the pandemic, you can't get a paper towel. You couldn't get. I remember I was sick with a horrible flu. I mean, one of the worst flus I'd had in February of 2020, and then when COVID really hit, I thought, well, maybe I have COVID early, and and it wasn't. I went, and it was a regular flu. But when I got back up, we hadn't been to the grocery store in a couple of weeks, and went to go to the grocery store, and it was surreal. It was like a movie. It was very apocalyptic in its feel, in that there was no sugar, there was no flour, like staples, like basic staples were gone. What an incredible lesson that was for me. Everyone had cleaned out the shelves while I was in bed, sick. So describe some of the components, if you would. Some of the politicians or economists are saying, hey, we could have a looming food crisis. Could you comment on, on those components and what we might, how would a near-term food crisis affect America? Certainly, if you're out on the farm, you're going to do better. If you're urban, maybe not so much. Could you talk about those dynamics?
Yeah. So you pointed to something very important, right? Which is the lower someone's income, the larger the share of food expenditures in their budget. And so necessarily the people who get hit by high food prices are the poor. you and I are going to feel it, right? We're going to feel it. And as you say, right, eggs are now, my wife was telling me yesterday that eggs are about twice as expensive as they used to be. And in my household, we eat a lot of eggs as well. But we are not going to feel it as much as someone who may be on one income or, less than one income. So then, they might work temporarily and so not kind of steadily. And so now take that globally, right? The people who are going to feel it the most are going to be food importing countries, and it's going to be poor households in those food importing countries. And so I really hate that my research becomes fashionable when things go really badly, but that's some of the work I've done on food prices has been about high and volatile food prices.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my most cited and most broadly cited articles, because it's cited by political scientists and sociologists and what have you, is a paper where I show that there's a causal relationship between high food prices and social unrest worldwide. And I wrote that in the context of the 2010-2011 food crisis, right? But to kind of to talk about the United States.
I don't want to interrupt you, but this is, I don't think we should move off your point too quickly. This is kind of a big deal because I think about perhaps we have a continuum where on one side of the continuum, we have what we might call a social behavior. And on the other side of the continuum, we might have a primal behavior. And as people struggle, as people have a hard time making it, I think people tend to shift from the social behavior more towards the primal behavior. Social media exacerbates these things. I have an issue with education here because I don't think we've equipped people. Like a lot of people think the answer is to equip people with money. I don't think so. I think it's to empower people with education. But if I turn the clock back to 1940 and we have a farm, I think people struggled more and were used to struggle more in the 40s. We had depression. I mean, it was people had that toughness, but there was much more social behavior in the midst of angst because people could provide food. They could go to at least a garden, and they didn't live the standard of living we do, even close, but they had necessary for their needs. And then the second point I might make is I don't consider myself like an oligarch at all. I mean, I don't have a yacht, I don't have five, but I knew enough to, when ExxonMobil was in the pandemic, was low, I knew enough to buy it cheap. And so when I go to the gas pump, while there's more money going to my gas pump, Exxon's at $97 a share. And I want to take that person across from the gas pump and say, look, if you will have some discipline and compounding in your life, you can go out and buy an option on the XLP like I did, sell an option to pay for it, and have food inflation insurance for the next year, $10,000 for minimal investment. The education makes me crazy that people don't know how to economically position themselves by what they purchase in this new world. You mentioned contract farming. I can do that as an individual. I can get futures on things. I can buy, if I look at either backwardation or contango, and I know what those terms mean, I can see what the market's doing from my little house here, and I don't need to be a rich guy. So I think that idea that you mentioned, there's this primal, and people begin to have anger and fear because they don't know what to do. That's a very real consequence of this breakdown. Yes.
Yeah, no, Andy, look, when COVID hit, I study supply chains. I mean, I work on food value chains. I've worked on that in somewhere or other since 2004. And I worried about our supply chains because I know just how just in time things are working, just how, again, looking at it as an economist, I see optimizing behavior. Yeah. And if you are optimizing, you're not accumulating 6 months worth of inventory. You're not kind of like, you don't have 65 different suppliers. You work with one because specialization is where you get your gains, right?
Inventory is dead money. I mean, you have inventory, You're losing. You can't go, like, if you go to Pottery Barn, that's a catalog. And they say, yeah, you can order that on the web, or yeah, we can get this in for you. I've tried to get patio furniture, 14 months, silverware and dishes, 5 months. It's incredible. And food, luckily, I imagine those supply chains are a little bit better because food's perishable and you got to get it out there. And so there's a little bit better on there, but the supply chain thing, it's fragile. Yeah.
Yes, but what I was about to say is when I looked at COVID and all my worries kind of in early COVID were not founded. Our supply chains in terms of food were surprisingly resilient because, like you, I didn't go anywhere. We are in a financial position in my household where we could get delivery. That was great. But I would see pictures of local area grocery stores with fresh fruits and vegetable racks completely empty. And that, as you say, that is just goes right. Yeah, I'm not a biologist and not a neuroscientist, but I think it's your reptilian brain, right? It just kind of hits you right in a way that forget thinking rationally about stuff. But at the same time, what I want to say is that I was really surprised, even being somewhat pessimistic, thinking, wow, those value chains are really optimizing. We're on the knife edge and now we'll fall off the knife edge. And that didn't happen under COVID. We are facing different circumstances for sure, right? We did not have a conflict involving 1/3 roughly of the world's wheat supply and other kind of commodities at that time. At the same time, I think we've managed to weather that largely unforeseen shock. And the good thing about food is that, okay, so if wheat gets more scarce, right, there are substitutes for wheat. It's not that you have, so sure, maybe you won't be able to get your durum wheat pasta that you're used to buying from the store. Like, I buy Barilla and that's the only thing I'll buy. I may not have that, right? I might have to eat something else. And it might be more expensive because when the price of one good goes up, the price of its substitutes go up as well.
Right.
But I am not, of course, again, I'm saying this sitting here in the United States. I think we will weather this storm. It won't be the easiest thing. As you say, people are already seeing it in terms of what they're paying for stuff. But where it's going to hit the hardest is going to be in low-income countries that are largely food importers that depend on those imports. And then, of course, things get even worse because when you have countries that say, we will stop exporting. I think India did that. I think Modi decided that they were going to stop exporting wheat, right, last week. That only makes things worse. And so then you get into this kind of system where, if I were a diplomat, then I would try to start offering them stuff so that they don't adopt those policies. And we call those beggar thy neighbor policies in international trade, because that's exactly what they do, right? You're effectively deciding that you're going to do something good for yourself at the expense of all those other countries that may be food importers, and not just food importers, but you've just created scarcity on the world market by doing that.
Yeah, I like to stay big picture because I think this is a big picture problem, but I want to balance that with some specifics. Why isn't there any baby formula?
I have no idea. I haven't followed what the baby formula thing is about. Really, you should talk to somebody else about that, because I think the average person on the street knows more about the baby formula shortage than I do.
Well, my kids are old now, so we haven't bought it in a long time. But I think it's interesting how, like you said, there are some foods what does Ukraine and Russia together probably produce? What'd you say, 30% of the world's wheat?
28%. Yeah.
Okay, so that's a lot to come up with, because they're not. Russia's probably still farming it though. It's probably Ukraine that has decided not to farm as much.
Yeah. Yeah, but with the sanctions against Russia, then we're not seeing it.
You can't buy it anyway. Yeah. Well, it's kind of like the pipeline going into Germany, though. If you're hungry, you'll buy it from Russia. I mean,
That's what I'm thinking. I say, we're with the sanctions, so maybe we aren't buying from there, but some other countries will, which will ease the pressure on the global demand, right? Yep, global supply, I should say. Yeah.
So what's the difference between a regional, local, and global food crisis? I mean, can we have a global food crisis? How does that stuff work? How do we find, like, if I look at my community, and well, I guess what people there, you mentioned the reptilian brain, their limbic system right now is lighting up saying, okay, how do I prepare for this? That's the big question. Maybe that's a better question. If you're a person that is, having a bunch of cortisol flood your system right now, and you got a stress hormone going, which is normal and natural and maybe even justified, if it were you, or, what would you do? What have you done? What are you doing to prepare your family in seeing these possibilities?
Yeah, that's the thing that worries me, Andy, because as you say, this kind of reptilian brain reaction, I think the worst we have to fear is fear itself. Because if
Mhm.
we all react, and so I was talking to, I took my kid to her piano lesson yesterday, and I was talking to the director of the school, and I used to take guitar lessons from him, and I asked him, "So how are you doing and stuff?" Because he had been sick for a couple of weeks, and I asked him, how he's holding up. So I'm in a food prep mode, and then he starts telling me about the impending food crisis, and I tried to reason with him as an economist who works on food. I try to
Yeah.
say, well, I'm not that worried. We're not going to see it. We're going to pay a little bit more here, but it's not going to be the end of the world. But that's the thing, right? If everyone reacts that way,
It's almost Pygmalion like, right?
well, but then what happens, right, is if everyone reacts that way, we're already kind of further
Yeah.
increasing the scarcity of food and raising prices. And there's this kind of feedback effect where it becomes this vicious cycle where food prices go up. People think, oh my goodness, food is about to get scarcer. And then they kind of stock up, and prices go up. And you can see where this is going, right? It becomes then a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you remember that from 2008. The first food crisis of this century was 2008. It was a rice crisis mainly. And that's when I started working on food price volatility, because I saw all the news and I thought, oh my God, I have to work on this. This is a big topic. And I remember at that time, Costco imposing a limit on how many bags of rice you
Yeah.
could buy.
And then
Any household could
yeah.
only buy 2 bags at a time. And I remember thinking, this is crazy.
Yeah.
Like that they would have to do that but
Got a guy going to 7 different Costco's around the valley, getting his 2 bags of rice simply
yeah.
because he can't have it. Now he's sitting on a mountain of rice at home that he could ski down.
But you can see why, right? Because there's this kind of anticipatory effect where people kind of like see the prices go up and they're like, oh, it's time to buy. I wish we could tell those people what Warren Buffett always tells kind of investors, right? It's when prices are low that it's time to buy, not when prices are high. But when it comes to food, which is a necessity, people think very differently. As you say, it all goes back to this kind of scarcity. If there's scarcity of high-end perfume, I don't care. I'm not going to worry about. I'm not going to go and buy more.
Right.
But if there's scarcity of something that I need daily, then that becomes more. And there are real worries, right? I mean, I firmly believe that most Americans could stand to eat a little bit less, myself included. But at the same time, we have kids who are between kids who are in utero. We have kids who are between the ages of 0 and 5 who need nutrients on a regular basis of a specific kind. Otherwise, they will be lacking in some, either physically or cognitively for the rest of their life. And so that is, I think we all know this in kind of subconsciously. And that's what drives that kind of behavior.
And another issue you have with this globalization, you have social media, you have news. I struggle with news of any kind, because whether you pick one side of the aisle or the other, I think everybody knows that news is presented rhetorically in anticipation of an emotional reaction to what is said. It is not so much about facts, but in the rhetorical context, and people will share things. There's so much emotion out there, and I've decided we don't live in the information age necessarily. I think we live in the misinformation age, where we have to each sort through. So when someone says food crisis or cries fire in the theater, people run. They run. And I think it's incumbent upon folks. It's funny. We want to depend on government, but the more we depend on government, the more you lose your independence. It's like it's like depending on the farmers rather than depending on myself. The moment I decide, what, I'm not going to do a garden anymore, I'm just going to go to the grocery store and buy it. Now you're dependent on that. So that kind of increases that anxiety. If you can't depend on your government, you can't depend on your employer, you can't depend on your farmer, you've lost your independence. And there's a feeling of fear if you don't know how to solve the problem yourself. And that's where maybe my own wimpiness, made me want to study money investing, is I didn't want to be without. I don't think it was so much greed. It was just that primal instinct of saying, look, I'm a father. I don't want to tell my son we have no medicine. I don't want to tell my son we have no food. And that drove me very hard, I think, to learn what I could about not just money, but about, that's why I'm having a conversation about food. I care
You
about.
see, all of this points to something super interesting, which is, if you study economics and if you approach economics from a neoclassical perspective, which is what most economists will kind of approach problems that way. With you might incorporate market failures and things like that, but
Yeah.
the broad thinking, if you believe in decreasing marginal returns, is that specialization brings good things, right? That it's if you go back, I think it's in chapter 1. It must be in chapter 1 of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, because everyone cites that example, and no one reads the whole thing, right? But Adam Smith talks about the pin factory, and he says, I went to a pin factory and it was a thing of wonder. You had, the process of producing pins broken down in small steps, and every guy on the line was doing his one thing. And that way they made, I don't know, however, I mean, I've read it once, but hundreds of pins and in a day. Whereas if I were to make pins at home, I'd probably make 12 a day.
Yeah.
But the trade-off there is the same as with investing, Andy. It's, yes, specialization allows us to get to higher returns and higher standards of welfare, but specialization also exposes us to risk, because the more specialized stuff gets, right? If we decide collectively we want to get, to take a not a fictitious example, we want to get chips for our computers out of one place. We have now become heavily dependent on that one place. And if they lock down, if they decide that they no longer want to trade with us, then we are up the proverbial creek.
Counterparty risk, really.
Yeah.
I mean, really. Okay. Before we wind up, I don't like to digress off topics, but when I have smart guys, like I couldn't get into if I applied to a business school, the people that decide to accept that application they'd have a side ache from laughing that I filled out the form. Okay. I mean, it's I was a broken down basketball player that, went to class. I had to get that C+ to stay eligible to play basketball. That was pretty much my mindset in those days.
Hey, it goes both ways. The reason why I became an academic is because I saw my parents, who are both small business owners, struggle with risk and uncertainty and uncertain demand. And I decided, no, this is not for me. I am going to get into a line where I can hope to get tenure at some point and not worry about downside risk.
There you go. You don't want it. But I have to ask you about some of the things on the periphery, and they're all interrelated anyway. I mean, the tentacles of policy and demographics determine much of the future. I think that's why we fight on it so much. You can look at the United States and we say, all right, you got to pull money out of your 401k at 72. There's a policy, there's a date, you're going to be eligible for such and such Medicare, Medicaid. Okay, we've made promises now. That's not bond money we've borrowed. That's money we've promised. That's an unfunded liability. So we got a $24 trillion economy. We got 168 trillion in unfunded liabilities. We got 30 trillion that we've borrowed, actually issued bonds to fund debt for. And the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve is it's breathtaking to see the growth of that. We've had inflation now that we haven't seen since the Carter years. Now, Volcker took interest rates to you got a mortgage at 17%. They took interest rates to double digits to curb the inflation. If we took interest rates, we are so dependent on credit expansion, not just sustenance, but expanding the credit. The Fed policies have really been to keep a floor on interest rates. They've been keeping them from going negative, right? The Feds has changed. They've involved themselves in the repo market now. So international banks and non-member banks have a floor. Without that repo market taken over, you have zero interest rate. So they fought for years to keep the thing from going negative because you need credit expansion to sustain this. My gosh, now we're having food inflation. We have inflation on food and gas, the two things they don't like in the CPI. The things that hurt people most aren't in the inflation index. Logic and politics, right? Is the fiscal path finally getting the point where it's like the incredible spending and the deficit spending? The MMT people have been cheering it on. I don't know how you feel about MMT. Is there a limit to this stuff? Stephanie Kelton wrote a book called The Deficit Myth. And she says, look, here's your rules for your household. Here's your rules for your business, but government they'll have to keep those rules. We just have to keep control of inflation. Well, can we, do you have a thought on the number of how high rates will have to go to curb this, because there's incredible deflationary force. Globalization was deflationary. Technology is incredibly deflationary. We have plenty of deflationary forces. We've been fighting the deflationary forces for 20 years now, or well, maybe since '08, fighting deflationary. Do you see an end or a nearing to the end of some type of reset or some type of event where we pay the piper, so to speak?
Yeah, again, many questions. Let me qualify everything that will follow. Let me qualify everything that follows with, I am an applied microeconomist. I study the behavior of individuals and firms. I don't do macro. Okay. What I'm about to say is the opinion of one guy, and the next guy probably has a more formed opinion than I do, but here's what I think. So I don't know much about MMT other than the fact that it exists. It seems like some kind of heterodox kind of theory and approach to monetary economics, but you're entirely right, that we've seen a lot of government spending in the last couple of years. The way I was trained was to approach this from a Keynesian perspective, where when things aren't going well, you increase government spending to stimulate the economy. I believe that we have forgotten the other half of the Keynesian model, which is when things are going well, you need to reimburse. Because governments, the way the electoral system is wired, the average person sees how the economy is going and they think it's the fault of politicians, which when in fact it could be, it isn't always, right? So whenever we blame the president or we credit the president of whatever stripe for unemployment rates, I find that there is a massive shortcut. Basically, people renounce thinking, as far as I can tell, when they do that. Yeah. So I think we have kind of forgotten the other half of the Keynesian model, which is when things go well, we need to pay our debts, we need to reduce the deficit. And ironically enough, it took kind of liberal governments in the 1990s, not just here with Clinton, but Blair did that and Chrétien did that in Canada as well, to kind of start thinking we need to bring this down, because the 1980s had been massively driven by deficits and tax cuts as well. But I think we have kind of forgotten that along the way. So I think when COVID hit, and with everything that's happening now, we're kind of doing the right thing by saying, look, people are losing their purchasing power. Let's give them some money. It may contribute some to inflation, but the hope is that it doesn't get us into a spiral. What I think we need to do is to kind of remember that kind of this idea that when the economy gets back to a good place, then take some of that surplus and spend it in a way, or to reimburse what we owe to other people. Now, what I think is going to need, what I think is required for all of this to cool down, I really hate to say this, but I think it'll maybe it'll have to be a recession for people to kind of like to bring those inflationary pressures down, and to kind of bring back this idea that, we owe a lot of money to a lot of people. Maybe we need to stop spending like drunken sailors. But again, I want to qualify everything I've just said with the fact that I'm not a macroeconomist. There are people out there, people that I know, people on my Twitter feed who are so much more qualified than I am to talk about this. And this is just my opinion on the topic. My probably malinformed or misinformed opinion.
Malinformed. Well, it's a fascinating time to be alive. I guess every generation has a self-concept that they're exceptional, and I guess we all have our exception.
Yeah, that allegedly Chinese curse of like, may you live in interesting times. Well, we are, my friend.
that's where I feel. So wonderful to speak with you.
Likewise.
Mark F. Belmar, excuse me. You've corrected me on pronunciation. I keep screwing up. Your website is markfbelmar.com. The book, if you're an economist and you want to dive into what you should have learned in grad school, but you didn't, it's called Doing Economics. Fantastic insight and very helpful opportunity for people to focus, settle down that reptilian brain and begin to think, okay, what is a rational way for me to approach this? What fears are rational? Because there are some that are, what aren't. And as always, I say, get your education. We also have resources at the Cashflow Academy where you can go, and we have lots of free classes that people can take. You mentioned, Keynesian economics. I think a good amount of the electorate doesn't know who John Maynard Keynes was. I don't think people really understand monetary policy. I think they understand what a Supreme Court is and maybe what a Congress is, but I don't think they understand what a U.S. Federal Reserve is, or a Central Bank of Japan, or a European Central Bank is. I don't think they know what a repo market is. And so I'm a huge education advocate because policies do matter. I don't care what policies people choose. I just wish they would be informed of them, and that thinking is not exited because someone gives a nice speech based on the cable news subscription that someone likes better than the other. So thank you for educating us. Thank you for your wisdom and your hard work in academia to help apply this. I love applied math. I love applied physics, and I love applied economics because application is why we always say, why do I study this in school? I'm never going to use it. And once you use the word applied, so we do get to use this a little bit. So I thank you for your wisdom, and you've been a delightful guest. Any last words for our listeners?
No, I just want to thank you for having me, Andy. It's been a pleasure.
Really, really fun. Thank you. This has been the Cashflow Academy podcast. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Cashflow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner. For more information on investing made easy, go to thecashflowacademy.com.